Searching for the best way to protect passwords and privileged accounts? Thycotic empowers security and IT operation teams to discover, secure, and manage all types of privileged accounts with the fastest time to value of any privileged access management solution. Get up and running fast with solutions for privileged account discovery, turnkey installation, automation, auditing, and reporting tools with Thycotic's free 30-day trial. Thycotic, the fastest growing PAM provider in the market, available both on-premise and in the cloud. Get started today with a free Thycotic secret server trial at securityweekly.com/Thycotic. Wide-scale adoption of cloud applications, an increase in remote workers, and expansion of branch offices has rendered the centralized, on-premises security model impractical. Enter Cisco Umbrella. Umbrella now includes secure web gateway, firewall, and cloud access security broker functionality, plus integration with Cisco SD-WAN, all delivered from a single cloud security service. It helps businesses of all sizes secure their network and extend protection to roaming users and branch offices. Security doesn't have to be complicated. Get simple, smart, and powerful security with Cisco Umbrella. Visit securityweekly.com/Cisco Umbrella to learn more. When it comes to web app and API security, the choice is simple. You can choose Fastly's security solution that teams will actually use in full blocking mode, just like 90% of their customers. Or you can stick with costly options that you probably just turn off. You can get Fastly's all-in-one platform that protects apps everywhere they live, however they're built. Or departments can agree to disagree. You can go to securityweekly.com/Fastly to learn more. Or you can just wish you had. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. In our May 27th webcast at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll explore the latest attacks against DNS and the latest techniques that make it possible to discover and disrupt attacks. The content is going to be very awesome and very surprising, even to Adrian and myself as we're still developing it, which makes for the best webcast. In our June 3rd webcast at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, you'll learn about pen testing tools, specifically Core Impact and others, and some of the updates there and how to use them on a regular basis. Join us on June 10th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for our webcast on insider risk to learn how to quickly mitigate data exposure risks. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast and /on-demand for the archive. We are more than happy. I think that means we're exuberant. More than happy is exuberant. We are exuberant to announce that we'll be at InfoSec World 2021 in person on October 25th through the 27th in Orlando. Our annual partnership with InfoSec World is extra special as we're all on the same team underneath the Cyber Risk Alliance. What does it mean for Security Weekly listeners and InfoSec World attendees? You get to see and hear from many of the Security Weekly team at the event, and you get 20% off your world pass. Please visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2021 to register. Now we're on to the enterprise security news. What do you say we just dig right in? And there's not a lot of stories, I mean, there are a good number, but not an overwhelming amount as we're accustomed to covering on the show, which lets us dig a little deeper. I had pulled two that I thought were interesting, and actually I'm going to be looking at myself, is that I think there's still this issue of when you run serverless functions such as Lambda, which is really just one type of a kind of, cloud native functions are in a separate category from a Lambda serverless function, Lambda being one of the more popular ones from AWS. Now, Datadog has made an announcement that allows you to collect telemetry from your serverless applications. So there are Lambda extensions that allow that collection, and developers can add custom business metrics, distributed tracing, and collect logs from serverless applications. We're actually just talking about that. We got a container that spins up and then spins down and goes away. The IP address is ephemeral. Collecting logs from that, I think, is not just important for monitoring as a Datadog's kind of perception of the problem, but it's also critical for security as well. I got to know what's going on in these serverless functions. It's super important, especially if they're in Azure, because the breakouts in Azure, there was like 2 or 3 in the stretch of 6 months. So,
yeah. Do you know how that technically works, though? That's what I'm curious about. Is how it says it deploys as a serverless function itself. But yeah, I guess I'd have to actually implement it to understand fully
I couldn't tell you exactly how it works. I have theories as to how it might integrate. There are logging facilities when you spin up containers, specifically in AWS, that I'm familiar with, that you could utilize to collect the logs. There are ways to shim a serverless application. I don't like security-wise. It's kind of a double-edged sword. Like you can throw a binary inside of a serverless app, but that's typically like not recommended.
Basically, it becomes agent-based, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also dependent on what the telemetry you're looking to collect is, right? If you're looking to collect operational runtime telemetry at at the lowest possible levels, that could be very different than serverless kind of application code telemetry or operational telemetry at those higher levels. And so I think it's a permissions thing. And I'm not sure exactly how it works technically either, but based on your description, I'm sure it's some kind of cross serverless permissions model that allows the data to be pulled out.
I'm sure there must be solutions that allow you to do it over an API. So when I code my serverless function, if I've got telemetry or data of any kind I want to send somewhere for historical purposes and logging, I just hit an API and the API sends it off to wherever.
Yeah, you can always instrument your app directly within the application itself, but obviously that has a certain level of overhead, a certain level of developer requirements.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you're better off relying on cloud native type solutions. And I don't know if Datadog in particular is using cloud native AWS types of calls or if they're requiring instrumentation into the app, into the serverless itself.
That was my bad. I was reading ahead. I was looking at the Imperva AWS Lambda one, which is talking about actively protecting.
Yeah,
not
that
just
was interesting too, right? Yeah,
telemetry.
So more obviously a straight security play from Imperva. They say you can protect against malicious activity, and a whole host of stuff. I put the whole list of basically what the functionality was in there. It can monitor. It has OAuth serverless top 10 coverage, which is really interesting. I haven't dug into exactly how that works.
So my gut tells me they're doing some kind of proxy model in front of the serverless Lambdas, because that's how Signal Sciences, I think, does it as well, which is now part of Fastly.
Yep.
And it makes a lot of sense because they don't have to be in app. They can come out of app and be in front of it and then eventually be in the CDN layer in the case of Imperva and Fastly both, being a CDN edge security model. So it's probably something that's proxy based, as the requests come back and forth. And it's likely built on top of the Signal Sciences acquisition or in the case of Imperva on top of the Previty acquisition that was done there.
Yeah, agreed.
Is there significant overhead with that?
No,
for the execution of the...
Yeah, it's cool because it's built on CDN technology for one, and the other thing is it just is looking at HTTP requests, so it's not touching the HTTP requests and responses, it's just mirroring them and monitoring them, and there's multiple ways to do that. If you're proxying inline, it could add some latency, but if we were talking 20
more
years
than
ago,
your traditional WAF.
Yeah.
No more than your traditional WAF would add today. Where some of the RASP technologies that were traditionally in-app would have a bit more impact because they were doing the detection inline in-app. And there were ways around that. Certain ones would kind of do detections in a somewhat asynchronous way within the app to lower down the overhead impact, but they all had slightly different models, and the proxy model that this is likely using is no more overhead impact than your WAF might have.
Yeah, it's interesting. That ties into another story that I had in my brain. API security, right? Because when I look at our own architecture and study how you would do an AWS Lambda, for example, what you end up with is a lot more APIs because you're spinning a process up, it's doing its thing. After it does its thing, it needs to send stuff back into your application. And I'm not talking about monitoring, but actually application logic and data, right, are part of that flow. That's done over API. You typically in AWS do the API gateway to manage all of your various services, whether that could be a container that you're running somewhere in AWS, and then half a dozen different ways to run a container, whether it's a straight cloud service that you're running, and whether it's a serverless function, right? It all kind of comes through in AWS design, at least the ones I've seen, right, come through that API gateway that manages those communications, which is I think, a much better way of thinking of applications. It does like increase complexity.
Microservices?
Yeah, but it's basically microservices that would be the overarching term, right? To talk about all these services collaborating together to make up the application, which makes API security really, really important. In another place where you might want to have both protection and data collection, and that's what Salt Security does. And they just raised a $70 million Series C, and for their Salt Security API protection platform. Sometimes just discovering that you've got APIs is part of the challenge, right?
Not to be confused with Salt Stack, which was acquired by VMware last year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that whole API security play, I think, is a big future, extremely high growth security segment. Primarily because the lift and shift that has occurred historically of your applications into the cloud, where you just take your app, you wrap it in a container, shove it in the cloud. Mm-hmm. That model obviously didn't leverage the scale and capabilities of cloud native apps. And so the natural next evolution for that is to take that app that you've just lifted and shifted into the cloud and break it up into its segmented components, and then rewrite those individual features or components in a more microservices-based model, and have all of those communicate via APIs. And that's really the rise of service mesh, the rise of microservices, and eventually serverless, if you want to go that far on your development model. And so I think that Salt Security raise is going to exit really, really well someday for the investors that came in at this stage.
I agree. And I don't want to make it sound easy. That's extremely difficult from a software engineering perspective to do that. I know, because we're going through it right now. It's a huge lift. That's why people, just like we did, I took my app, I put it in a container, and I stuffed it in the cloud. And then I was like, wait, why do I have to maintain a whole bunch of code that, transcodes videos or handles authentication, or then you start like plucking them out.
Yep.
That's the way to go.
That's what I call the atomization of applications. And that's really, every company is going through that right now, based on the back of digital transformation that they had, shoving things into the cloud, saying, hey, we got to become a cloud native, cloud first company. They shove it in there, then they have to break it apart. And then, I think the investments that went into microservices and some of the API security and management stuff were early investments. I think this is going to be a massive growth opportunity. And clearly somebody else does too, by putting $70 million into Salt Security.
Yeah. Let's see. What else do we have on the list? Zscaler picked up a company called Smokescreen. Smokescreen is a platform to help customers protect networks, applications, and endpoints with deception decoys. I had not heard of Smokescreen before. Mm-hmm. Had you, Adrian? I know you were.
Yeah. So, I mean, full disclosure, I used to work for Thinkston. Smokescreen was a competitor. So, yeah, having done some of our competitive intelligence there, I was aware of them. But so that's interesting. Certainly with deception, I think its usefulness has been proven, and so kind of the next step there is to make it as integrated and just no-brainer to deploy it as possible, in as many places as you can without triggering false positives and stuff like that. So, honestly, for somebody like Zscaler, who's trying to provide most of the stack for you, mm-hmm. it absolutely makes sense. It's as long as they do it correctly. Like it's one of those things where if done right, it's beautiful. If you mess it up and you start bombarding people with false positives, you're going to burn it for your whole customer base. So they just have to be careful in how they implement it, but it should be a no-brainer win for them.
There's two things about the deception and decoy market that I've always thought. It's not actually about the deceptions and decoys that are going to determine whether that market or a company in that market is successful. What really matters there is the ease of deployment, as Adrian mentioned, and then the so what, right? So if I jam out a bunch of decoys into my environment, and first of all, if I can't single click deploy it into my environment, forget it. The project's over. But let's assume that they've passed that hurdle. I put a bunch of them out there and hits occur. and I can't get an active so what or proper next steps on how to handle that so what, it just becomes a noisy alert system that doesn't really give me value. And I think that's going to be the key to providing the best play here. The other thing that is interesting to connect it back to what we were just talking about with the rise of the APIs, the rise of applications and application atomization, is I do think that decoys at an app level could be very valuable and very interesting as we move more towards cloud native infrastructures where the enterprise doesn't own the infrastructure. We have less of a need for decoys at the infrastructure layer and more of a need for decoys at the application layer. Now, specifically how that manifests itself, I'm not sure, right? Is it a page of an app that just pops up or some new feature or section that once you determine somebody's high risk, it's kind of like almost like a in-app CAPTCHA that's more focused on decoy? I'm not entirely sure, but I think there's something that can be done there.
Yeah, so with canary tokens, there are some use cases there. One that we would pitch is create an image canary token and put it on a page that somebody would scan, like /admin, but doesn't actually exist on that system. And now it does exist, and every time somebody goes there, you get an alert. And 100% of those alerts are people trying to scan your website or manually, looking for a way in. And you can just treat all those IP addresses that those requests come from as scanners.
Yeah, I think it gets tricky when you want a one-click deploy, but it's a custom application. That gets tricky. I think that's probably why we haven't seen a big support for that inside the application. Because I started thinking about in my own apps, like, how would I put decoys in there? And it's like a whole design process. And, Adrian, I think your suggestion is great. Like, just do it at the URL level is probably a great way to start in that.
Yeah, I mean, you're almost reverse engineering the scan. So generally, where you start with decoys is by looking at attacker behavior. You look at the stuff that they're likely to do, and then you just build for that. You just plan for that and set traps for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you could even go so far as to say, like, look at input fields. And basically where input fields might have traditional like rate limiting style attacks where they hit something, credential stuffing, for example, into an input field. Once you see a certain level, creating some kind of decoy that moves them or gives them an actual response where they wouldn't have seen it before, right? There's a lot of different things that can happen there, but I think that market's not near the automation that would need to occur to make that single click and easy enough to use.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that almost gets into the anti-bot space, like
it sure does.
What was it? White Ops?
White Ops, Arcos Labs. Arcos Labs is a big player there. There's a lot of bot protection and fraud protection type solutions that this would start to overlap into.
Yeah.
Let's see. ServiceNow is delivering new security integrations with Microsoft to automate security workflows. So new integrations include Azure Sentinel, Microsoft Threat and Vulnerability Management, Microsoft Teams, and Microsoft SharePoint. Microsoft's got a pretty cool stack of solutions, both straight security in addition to some of those operational and workflow management things, and I can see it integrating kind of nicely with ServiceNow. And a lot of those things we were just talking about it earlier. They're really low cost or just included with your subscription. And I like almost behind the scenes, Microsoft has just done a great job of coming up with these low code or no code solutions to help you with your workflows, and integrating that with something like ServiceNow, I think is really, rather than writing custom applications, I mean, you can do a lot of stuff with the whole Microsoft Power Automate, Power App Suite.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure I want to use my Teams for incident management, though. It depends on the incident. Yeah, because that's the Teams integration is integrating it with ServiceNow's incident response product.
Yeah, it's like rather than use Slack, use Teams, and you've got this technology overload. Where do messages go?
Yeah, it's just, I can see some folks thinking, no, I want to use something a little bit more out of band for my IR communications.
Yeah, no, that's a great point too.
Then something incredibly integrated,
yes.
At a time when usually email is the first thing to fall.
It's true. Yeah, Slack can, be largely off-prem and outside of any of your other infrastructure in in an IR perspective, a good back channel communication.
Yeah. Always interesting to see what they're doing here. They're also integrating SharePoint with the same tool, the same IR tool.
I think the problem for me with the Microsoft suite is just there is so much functionality, and you just get lost like really quickly between their security solutions and their productivity solutions. You can do it's almost like the pearl of solutions. You can solve the problem like 6 different ways. I'm like, what? I just want one way sometimes, and not all those options.
Yep.
I usually don't cover awards, but SentinelOne had some pretty interesting picks in terms of their awards or interesting awards that they won. So recently, their endpoint security solution came out really well in the MITRE ATT&CK evaluation performed by MITRE Ingenuity. They've released the results, and SentinelOne was the only vendor to achieve complete visibility with 0 misdetections across both Windows and Linux environments. That was pretty interesting. Not that coverage defines 100% of your evaluation criteria. Coverage is also important when we talk about endpoints and vulnerability management. So that was an interesting kind of win for them.
Yeah, I will mention step one, when doing these evaluations with MITRE is the vendor comes in and sets up the product. So
wouldn't the vendor come in? The vendor would come in and set up the product for me, usually, in an enterprise setting.
Would they set it up the same way for an enterprise as for like a closed evaluation, though?
That's the $1 million question right there, Adrian.
Yeah, how much... If you take that same configuration they used in that case and threw it into an enterprise, would it be 1,000 times noisier? I don't know.
Right. Yes. Signal to noise ratio is a thing. They also won the Gartner Magic Quadrant for endpoint protection platforms.
I don't know if that's winning, but congratulations.
I put that in there to invoke an emotional response.
Singularity XDR platform.
Oh, don't get me started on XDR.
Is that what SentinelOne is calling their solution?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Innovative Singularity XDR platform. It's just amazing how many companies just turned around and had XDR like a couple months after it became a thing.
Well, when we all struggle to define it, everyone can have it because there's no good definition for it. So everyone can have XDR. No one knows what it means. It's provocative. Yeah, we got that.
Yeah.
The way we define it, we have it, right?
As we understand it, we just rebrand EDR to XDR. It was pretty quick find and replace the code. Well, so in fairness, I think, and it's funny because in the SOAR space also, in the previous segment, we're talking about how, SOAR is, SIEM vendors are becoming interested in SOAR. But SOAR was always kind of there with the SIEM vendors in the first place. Like it just wasn't as developed as we're seeing it now. I remember over 10 years ago, Qualys had SOAR functionality in there. It just wasn't well integrated. You had to do a lot more of the work yourself, but you could build full-on workflows with it. And then I think Logarithm only a couple years after that, like 2012, 2013, was already just head first going into going down that SOAR route. And I think a lot of the EDR folks like SentinelOne were already 98% of the way there, before the new branding of XDR became a thing. So in all fairness, I think a lot of them were already going in that direction anyway.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Rapid7, with their acquisition of DivvyCloud, positioning themselves to reduce risk with identity access management. It's interesting. This is kind of what it sounded to me when I read this was constant monitoring continuous monitoring, if you will, of your IAM policy, especially as it relates to cloud environments, which we know what a big rat hole that is, right? Is going down, applying RBAC in your cloud environment and how often it changes, right? We talked about having a microservices architecture, and I think the dark thing that we don't talk about is how to manage those roles and responsibilities of your apps and services and users inside of the cloud environment. And I thought it was a good play to say, like, we can monitor that, and not just a snapshot in time like traditional vulnerability management, but actually monitor as you have changes and put roadblocks in and collect telemetry when someone opens up an S3 share or that microservice now is exposed to the world. Like, those are some of the really basic kind of hygiene things that you have to worry about with your cloud. And I think you can do a good job of managing those by monitoring the IAM in your cloud provider.
I think there's two sides to this one, to the market that DivvyCloud really kind of was dancing around. There's the current state or the at-rest state of your cloud IAM, right? So understanding what the RBAC looks like, who has permissions to what at any given moment in time, are those permissions overextending, et cetera, et cetera. But then the other side of that is like usage of permissions. Like, if permissions aren't used, do they need to exist?
Right.
So there's kind of a more operational side that you can't get just from the metadata of the state of the environment, but you have to look at the actual accesses that are occurring, what privilege levels were being achieved. So almost integrating like a PAM on the right side plus a cyber asset management focused on identity on the left side.
Yeah, and I know you're at Jupiter One, right? But asset management certainly, comes into play, knowing what you have in the cloud, and then because you got to know that before you can say, well, what privileges should the users in this service have? What rights should it have? Like, the example is, I knew we had the service running, and I went to go test it from home, and it's like, that service isn't available. I'm like, I can get just to the office, and then I asked Marcin, our cloud architect, and he's like, yeah, no, I did the rules correct. I'm like, good. Yeah. I'm glad you did it right. But that's just like a point in time kind of thing. It'd be nice to have something that constantly monitors that, because anyone could just go in and make a small change, and now, bam, that service is exposed to the internet.
Yeah, so I think there is an asset management side of that equation, as you mentioned, but there's also, I think, the operational linkages that have to occur between the two, and that's where the value becomes very unique. And I know of at least one stealth startup that's covering this area that's probably going to be out of stealth by end of summer that we'll be able to mention that is exactly doing that.
Yeah, I'd also be curious, I think largely what we're talking about is administrative users, developers, cloud architects, and engineers. But then it also ties into your application. If you're using cloud services, like we just started to manage your end user authentication and roles and permissions, that to me is equally as important, right? Yep. Because I want to make sure that's not broken, misconfigured, or someone's trying to, break in via that mechanism.
Yeah, I think the acquisition was smart by Rapid7. There's a lot of white space here.
Yeah. Kemp launches a zero trust architecture. I've not heard of Kemp before. Always on application experience company. Playing in zero trust. I don't pretend to understand what they were talking about in their description, to be honest with you.
And that's fine, because I don't pretend to understand what zero trust means. So we're on the same page. Zero trust and XDR. Let's take them both out to pasture.
It's proxy authentication.
I understand zero trust. I'm fine with zero trust, but XDR, I'm still. We actually had two great Forrester analysts that I did micro interviews with for RSA that I really need to follow up with, so they can help explain some of that to me.
Well, I need an education from you soon, Adrian, on zero trust, because zero trust to me is a concept where everything is just zero trust of each other. And to be able to say that zero trust in a product to me has never rung true. So I definitely need a brain dump from you, maybe not on this show, but at some point in time.
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time with the Edgewise team that was acquired by Zscaler, and they really, truly did have to this day, right? They call it, I don't remember now, I apologize, but they call it something different, but it is that product, and it does work really well. I've not seen anything comparable to that. Could be why Zscaler, acquired them and integrated them with the stack.
Well, I mean, zero trust is like SBOM. Like it's an idea. It's for an architecture specifically. But there's a lot of components of it, and there's a lot of different ways of doing it, like something like an SBOM. But even though they're nothing alike, the problem you run into is when companies start using zero trust metaphorically. So I remember like a couple months ago, I had 2 vendors give me briefings in the same day using zero trust as a metaphor. Their products had nothing to do with the zero trust architecture at all, and it just frustrates me when they muddy the waters like that, just because it's a hot term and they want to use it.
Which is why I've shied away from that term and have become turned off by that term, because to me it is exactly what you're talking about. It's a design. It's a
philosophy.
thing. It's not.
It's like DevOps.
Yeah, it's a philosophy.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a product that you can just sell the philosophy of, right?
I mean, so zero trust. If I were to explain it in a single sentence, it would be just applying least privilege to employee access controls.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I kind of liken it, if I had to use an analogy, when we went to Disney and we rode the cars. I can't remember the ride, but it's in Magic Kingdom, and anyone can get in the car, right? But there's guardrails. Like I physically can't bump into anyone at least on a left to right, kind of basis. I can only go so fast. It's kind of those guardrails for your applications. Right,
and which is why, take it back to the product that delivers those guardrails. Perfect. Awesome. I get it. But the problem then is we have zero trust identity, zero trust this, zero trust that. And now the whole thing's just been shot.
Yeah. And I think that analogy came to me looking at all the technology from Zscaler, right? And through their acquisition, it actually does that for you. I mean, he showed us demos at one time of like, you've got a Python script and it can't do that stuff because it's limited by those guardrails. To me, that's a good implementation, but you're right. The term gets overused and it muddies the waters. The last story here is AWS is launching a containerized web application solution called App Runner. It's doing a lot for you. It allows you to rapidly develop, deploy, and run containerized web applications and APIs, handling all operational aspects, provisioning, scaling, and managing container orchestration, load balancing, and CI/CD pipelines. That's
and why
a lot.
Not?
Yeah, but
why not? It's AWS doing what only AWS can do.
Make it easier.
If you're fully bought into the garden, very similar to, like the Tile competitor that you saw Apple come out with.
Mm-hmm.
Like Tile could never make their product easier to use than Apple could, because Apple's basically shortcutting the process of onboarding one of these little devices that you use to find your lost keys or whatever.
But much like the Apple example, it can have vulnerabilities and exploits.
Oh, sure. But yeah, from a but at the same time, it's AWS has a pretty good track record, when it comes to securing their side of things. Maybe not always the best track record in educating their customers on how to secure their end of it. I mean, the documentation has been there, but don't underestimate the need for secure defaults there. People, if you give them rope, people will hang themselves.
Well, and I guess BHIS did some research into different AWS services, and as they're auto scaling, they spin up new instances, but not necessarily with the same security controls that some of the other instances have. And so when I saw the App Runner announcement, I'm like, that could be a recipe for disaster in that sense, that as they're auto scaling and managing and load balancing, if the new stuff that's automatically spinning up doesn't have the same security controls, that could spell disaster for the security in your application.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't looking at this with my security hat on. I was more looking at it from the
usability.
Small company, small team,
sure.
Single full stack developer. Like this is beautiful.
Cool. Anything else you guys want to talk about?
See the ServiceNow Uptycs, 50 million?
Oh, yeah, I forgot to talk about that one.
I had 2 funding items also.
Yeah, Uptycs was a sponsor on the program. Just awesome technology, right? It's so cool how they're able to collect all of that using, what was the Facebook thing they built it on?
OS Query.
OS Query.
Yeah.
I looked at OS Query. I'm like, wow, that could be really cool. And then Uptycs came along. I'm like, yeah, that's what I wanted out of OS Query. I didn't want to do all the work myself. Now I've got a well-funded startup, right, that's doing that. So, and I think Ganesh is has the interview on this segment that'll air. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you hear more about Uptycs from Ganesh on the next segment as well.
Yeah. No, I think Uptycs is a super kick-ass company. I've always followed them, and I think the ServiceNow in strategic investment alongside the round that they raised is very important for Uptycs, because Uptycs has insight and visibility into assets.
Right.
Into what needs to be scanned.
And the cloud, that's their huge differentiator. They're like, we're not just an endpoint thing. We live in the cloud.
And so put yourself into the shoes of ServiceNow, where they're a traditional CMDB that's focused on endpoints, right? And it's just hard for them to move into the cloud. So making strategic investments in companies like Uptycs makes a whole lot of sense.
And I think that's kind of going to be the key for Uptycs and any other EDR companies out there. It is just fully realizing, all the use cases for that data that they're collecting, because there's so many things that they can make easier, and they even replace in some cases. We're even seeing a lot of vulnerability management use cases come out of EDR products, and I think that's going to be the big challenge. There is building all that and making it, kind of a no-brainer integration with some of these other products. Like ServiceNow, where, I'd say 9 out of 10 ServiceNow CMDBs you look at are out of date. You need some automated method of keeping them accurate and up to date. And here you go. At least for the ones where you have Uptycs installed, the corporate owned stuff.
I think it's something I've described for a few years now as the power of the agent. Everybody bags on agents. They hate agents. They only want one agent. And so what agent is consistently deployed? The endpoint agent, right? And so you can do so many things, whether it's using OS Query as that agent or using a CrowdStrike agent or Carbon Black agent or whatever. You can do so many things once you're on device. You're able to leverage that into secondary and tertiary markets alongside just endpoint protection. And that's why it's super valuable, is you have that inventory.
Yep.
Outstanding. Adrian Tyler, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. Although this is not the end of the show, we've got a pre-recorded interview coming up. Drew Rose from Living Security and Ganesh Pai from Uptycs. Stay tuned.